The old wars were ending, and in the silence that followed, darker things began to rise beneath the mountains of Middle-earth. Far beyond the green kingdoms of men and elves, hammers echoed in a land of ash where no living thing should have endured. Good evening, my friends. I'm John, and tonight I invite you to walk the black roads of Mordor, where fire burned beneath the stone, and the greatest gate in Middle-earth was first raised against the west. The wind came first to Mordor. Before walls were raised, before iron rang upon stone, before the first watchfire burned beneath the mountains of shadow, there was only the wind crossing the ash plains from the east. It moved over cracked earth and barren ridges where no grass grew, carrying the bitter scent of old fire from Orodruin, whose red heart smouldered even in sleep. The land seemed dead to wandering eyes, yet beneath the black soil, ancient heat still breathed, and in the dark hollows among the rocks, things crept and endured that had fled the ruin of the elder days. Far away beyond the Efelduath, green lands flourished beneath young kingdoms of men and elves, but here in Mordor, silence ruled like a waiting king. The silence was broken one evening by the sound of hammers, faint and distant at first, echoing through the narrow pass of Cirith Gorgor. Then came horns, harsh as the cry of carrion birds, and long files of laborers entered the black land beneath the whips of armed guards. Baradan walked among them with iron rings upon his wrists, though the chain between the prisoners had been removed before they crossed the mountains. The captains did not fear escape now. Every man who saw Mordor understood swiftly that there was nowhere to flee. Ash drifted through the air in thin grey veils, settling upon cloaks and hair like the dust of tombs, while the jagged cliffs on either side narrowed until the sky itself became a thin strip of pale silver above. Baradan kept his head lowered as he walked, conserving his strength, yet his mason's eye still measured the stone around him. The cliffs rose sheer and black, broken by natural shelves where towers could easily be raised. A single wall across the pass would choke all passage between the mountains. He understood then why they had brought builders instead of soldiers alone, and the thought hollowed his stomach more deeply than hunger. Ahead of him, an old laborer stumbled upon loose shale, and one of the overseers rode back with a curse, striking the man behind the neck with a rod of iron until blood darkened the rocks. No one stopped. No one spoke. The column moved onward around the fallen body, while the overseer spat into the dust and turned his horse away. Baradan clenched his jaw so hard that pain spread into his temples, yet he kept walking, for he had already learned during the long road eastward that pity could kill a man faster than cruelty. Beside him trudged a broad-shouldered carpenter named Narus, whose beard had become stiff with ash over the past days. The older man glanced once toward the corpse and muttered under his breath, "They waste hands, as though they have an endless supply." Baradan answered quietly, careful not to draw notice. "Perhaps they do." Narus gave a grim laugh that ended almost at once. "No kingdom has endless men. Remember that." Yet when he lifted his eyes towards the black mountains ahead, even he seemed uncertain of his own words. By dusk, they reached the camp at the mouth of Cirith Gorgor, and there the full scale of the labor became clear. Thousands of workers filled the valley floor beneath rows of rough tents and timber pens. Fires burned red through the gloom, while carts creaked endlessly across the earth, carrying stone blocks from nearby quarries. Orcs swarmed everywhere, some huge and crooked-limbed, others squat and long-armed like apes, all armed with spears or cruel knives. The stench of smoke, sweat, and unwashed bodies lay over the camp like a blanket. At the center rose a great wooden scaffold surrounding the foundations of two immense towers already half-built from black stone. Their unfinished shapes loomed against the fading sky like broken teeth. Baradan stared despite himself, and an overseer noticed. "Look well," the man snarled as he passed. "Your bones will rot beneath those towers before the work is done." That night, the prisoners were driven into long trenches, roofed with timber and hides against the cold mountain wind. There was little room to lie down, and less for sleep. Men coughed in the darkness, while somewhere beyond the camp wolves howled among the rocks, though Baradan suspected the voices were not truly wolves at all. Naru sat beside him, chewing hard black bread that tasted of dust. "You worked stone before this?" he asked, after a long silence. Baradan nodded once. "In the east, near the inland sea. Temples, storehouses, harbor walls." The older man grunted thoughtfully. "Then they will keep you alive, longer than most. Skilled hands are valuable here." Baradan looked toward the trench entrance where red firelight flickered. "Who commands this place?" Narus hesitated before answering, and when he finally spoke, his voice had fallen nearly to a whisper. "Some say a king from the south. Others say a servant of the great enemy himself survived the ancient wars. I have heard many names on the road, but the orcs speak none aloud." Sleep came slowly. Baradan dreamed of home beside the sea of Rune, where warm rain struck white stone courtyards and gulls wheeled above bright waters. He saw his younger sister carrying clay lamps along the harbor wall, while musicians played in the market square beyond. Then the dream darkened. Smoke rolled across the sea. Towers rose where the harbor had stood, black towers without windows, and a vast iron gate swung open upon a plain of ash. He woke with a sharp breath to the sound of distant metal striking metal somewhere outside in the darkness. Around him, the trench stirred with uneasy murmurs. A man near the entrance whispered a prayer in a trembling voice, but another hissed for silence at once. Then came a deep horn call from beyond the camp, long and mournful, and every voice died instantly. Before dawn, the labor gangs assembled beneath torchlight. Frost silvered the black earth, though heat still drifted from cracks in the distant slopes of Orodruin. Baradan was assigned to a quarry detail alongside Narus and 30 others, escorted by orc guards into the hills north of the camp. The quarry itself had once been a natural ravine, but now its walls were hacked into terraces, where men chipped endlessly at dark volcanic stone. Dust filled the air so thickly that breathing became painful after only an hour. Baradan worked in silence beside the others, splitting blocks along natural seams while overseers shouted from above. By midday, his hands bled openly despite the leather wrappings around his palms. Yet the stone was strong and clean beneath the surface, nearly black, but threaded with faint red veins, like cooling fire. He hated himself for admiring its quality, even while he labored for his captors. Toward evening, a disturbance spread through the quarry. Hammers slowed. Men glanced upward. Along the ridge above the ravine, several mounted figures had appeared against the darkening sky, motionless as carved idols. The orc overseers immediately lowered their heads and backed away from the central path. One rider descended slowly into the quarry, cloaked entirely in black. His face remained hidden beneath a hood, yet an unnatural stillness seemed to move with him, as though even the wind recoiled from his presence. The mounted figure stopped near the stone lifts where broken blocks were sorted. No command was spoken loudly, but every laborer nearby froze where he stood. Baradan felt cold despite the heat of the quarry. The rider dismounted at last, and though his hands were gloved, the very movement carried terrible strength held tightly in restraint. An overseer hurried forward, bowing low. "3 dead from exhaustion today, Lord," he said nervously. "But the Western Foundation rises ahead of schedule." The hooded figure said nothing for a moment. Then a voice answered, deep and measured, neither loud nor hurried, yet it carried clearly across the ravine. "Ahead of schedule is meaningless if the stone is flawed." He placed one gloved hand upon a newly cut block. The stone cracked instantly down the center with a sound like thunder. Several men recoiled in fear. "This weakness runs through the lower seam," the figure continued. "If such work reaches the towers, the gate will fail before 100 years have passed." The overseer stammered apologies, sweat pouring down his face despite the cold. Baradan lowered his eyes quickly, but not before glimpsing pale fire flickering beneath the stranger's hood where no mortal eyes should have shone. The rider turned then, walking among the laborers with slow, deliberate steps. Men shrank aside without command. Baradan kept his gaze fixed upon the ground, yet he felt the presence draw nearer, like the approach of a storm. At last the voice halted beside him. "You!" Baradan's throat tightened. "Lift your head." He obeyed carefully. Beneath the hood he saw little save darkness, and 2 terrible eyes, bright as embers buried deep within a furnace. The figure studied him in silence. "You understand stone," he said at last. It was not a question. Baradan forced himself to answer steadily. "I was trained as a mason, Lord." "Then speak truth. Would this foundation endure?" Fear warred with instinct inside him. Every craftsman knew the answer already. He swallowed once. "Not for ages, Lord. The lower layers must be cut deeper into the bedrock." For a heartbeat, the quarry became utterly silent. Then the hooded figure gave a slow nod. At last, an honest tongue among cowards. He turned toward the overseer, whose face had gone pale as old wax. "The foundations will be rebuilt, the weak stone removed entirely. If labor fails, replace the labor. If time is lost, recover it with blood." The overseer fell to one knee at once. "It shall be done, Lord." Without another word, the dark rider mounted again and ascended the quarry path toward the ridge. The other cloaked figures followed behind him, like shadows lengthening at sunset. Only after they vanished into the dusk did breath and movement return among the workers. Naru stepped close beside Baradan, speaking barely above a whisper. "Do you know who that was?" Baradan stared toward the empty ridge where the rider had disappeared. The cold in his chest had not faded. "No," he said quietly, though in his heart he feared he already knew. The rebuilding of the Western Foundation began the very next morning, and with it came a cruelty harsher than anything the laborers had yet endured. Entire sections of finished stone were torn apart under torchlight, while overseers screamed for speed from dawn until long after nightfall. Men worked in shifts without rest, hauling broken blocks away from the trenches and lowering fresh-cut stone deep into the earth beneath the towers. The camp no longer slept fully. Fires burned at all hours, and the sound of iron striking rock rolled constantly through Sirith Gorgor, like distant thunder trapped between the mountains. Baradan soon learned that the Dark Rider's command carried the weight of absolute law, for even the orc captains trembled whenever word came that the hooded lord might return to inspect the works. No one spoke his name, yet everywhere whispers spread like sickness through the trenches. Some called him the Black Captain. Others named him the Sorcerer of the South. A few older men, usually after dark when fear loosened their tongues, whispered another title in dread: Gorthor, the Cruel. Baradan spent his days waist-deep in foundation pits, where volcanic water seeped through the cracks beneath the mountains. The labor was murderous. Thick ropes cut into bleeding shoulders while cranes groaned overhead, lowering blocks that weighed as much as ox carts. More than once he saw workers crushed outright when chains snapped or scaffolds collapsed under strain. The dead were dragged aside without ceremony and buried beyond the camp in trenches marked only by piles of black stones. Yet amid the misery, Baradan noticed something strange. Certain accidents seemed too precise to be chance. A pulley rope sliced nearly through before breaking. Support wedges vanished from beneath loaded cranes. Once an entire shipment of iron spikes was found, ruined with sand packed into the barrels so cleverly that no overseer could determine who had done it. The orcs blamed lazy workers and answered with beatings, but Baradan began to suspect another hand moved within the camp. One evening, as the western sky faded beyond the mountains, Baradan and Narus were ordered to carry tools into a newly opened tunnel beneath the northern tower. Torches smoked heavily inside the passage, coating the rough stone ceiling with greasy soot. The air smelled of damp earth and sulfur rising from deep fissures below. Baradan ran his hand along the tunnel wall as he walked and frowned. "This section was carved recently," he murmured. "Too recently. The stone here is unstable." Narus glanced uneasily into the darkness ahead. "Tell the overseers that if you wish, another beating." A few steps later, they found why the tunnel had been abandoned. Half the passage had collapsed inward, burying beams and tools beneath broken rock. Yet Baradan noticed narrow gaps between the fallen stones, where someone small might still crawl through. He crouched near the rubble, studying it in silence. "This was no cave-in," he said quietly. "The support braces were cut." Narus stared at him sharply. "Then keep your voice down, fool." A sound interrupted them then, faint but unmistakable. Somewhere beyond the collapsed stones came 3 slow taps against rock. Both men froze. The taps sounded again, deliberate and measured. Narus gripped Baradan's arm hard enough to hurt. "Back away," he whispered. "Now." But before either man could move, a small stone shifted within the rubble and rolled into the torchlight. For an instant, Baradan glimpsed a human eye peering through the narrow crack beyond. The face vanished almost immediately. Then silence returned to the tunnel, save for the hiss of torches. Narus pulled him backward toward the entrance. "Say nothing," the older man muttered urgently. "Do you hear me?" Nothing. Baradan allowed himself to be dragged away, though his thoughts churned the entire walk back through the camp. That night, rain fell over Mordor for the first time since their arrival. It came cold and thin from the western sea, hissing softly against ash and stone, while clouds swallowed the glow of the stars. Water leaked through the roof of the labor trench, dripping steadily beside Baradan as the others slept around him in exhausted silence. He could not sleep. The hidden eye in the tunnel haunted his thoughts. At last he heard movement nearby and saw Narus sitting awake with his back against one of the support beams. The old carpenter's face looked older still in the dim light, lined deeply by fatigue and fear. "You have seen them before," Baradan said quietly. Narus did not answer at once. Rain tapped softly above them. Finally he sighed. "A few times, never clearly. They hide beneath the tunnels and the old lava cracks." "Who are they?" Baradan asked. "Runaways," Narus replied. "Escaped workers. Men from the first camps before we arrived. Some have survived here for years." Baradan stared at him in disbelief. "Years? In Mordor?" Narus gave a humorless smile. "There are places even orcs avoid. Deep fissures, forgotten caverns, old fire tunnels beneath the mountains." He leaned closer, lowering his voice further. They steal tools, sabotage cranes, poison supplies when they can. Anything to slow the building. Baradan remembered the cut braces and ruined iron spikes. Why have the guards not hunted them down? They have tried, Naruz answered, many times. But the mountains are vast, and something else walks in those dark places. Even orcs fear certain tunnels after nightfall. Before Baradan could ask more, shouting erupted outside the trench. Both men stiffened instantly. Heavy boots splashed through the mud above as horns blared across the camp. The trench entrance burst open and torchlight flooded inside. Orcs stormed through the crowded shelter, dragging half-awakened men upright by their hair and chains. "Out!" one guard roared. "All of you, out now!" Workers stumbled into the cold rain while overseers moved among them, counting faces. Baradan saw panic spreading through the camp. One of the supply depots near the quarry blazed fiercely against the darkness, flames twisting high into the storm. Barrels of pitch exploded with sharp cracks, sending sparks swirling into the wind. Orcs hauled prisoners into rough lines, while captains shouted accusations in their harsh tongue. At the center of the confusion stood a dead guard with his throat cut cleanly from ear to ear. Baradan forced himself not to look too long. The precision of the wound chilled him more than the blood itself. A tall overseer with a scarred face strode before the assembled workers, carrying a whip coiled around one arm. Rain streamed down his black cloak while fury twisted his features. "Saboteurs move among you," he shouted. "Supplies burned, guards murdered. Someone aided the tunnel rats tonight." No one answered. The only sounds were the crackling fire and distant thunder beyond the mountains. The overseer's gaze swept slowly across the lines until it settled upon a young laborer, trembling near the front. Without warning, he seized the man by the collar and dragged him forward. "You were missing from your station," he snarled. The prisoner stammered desperately that he had fled the flames in confusion, but the overseer struck him across the mouth before he finished speaking. Confusion breeds treason. Then, before the entire camp, the man was hanged from a crane hook beside the burning depot, while the workers were forced to watch. Baradan stood motionless beneath the rain, his stomach tight with helpless anger. Beside him, Naruz muttered softly, "They punish weakness because they are afraid." Baradan glanced sideways. "Afraid of escaped slaves?" "Not only them," Naruz replied. "Fear spreads quickly in places built upon terror. One crack becomes two. Then walls begin to fall." Before Baradan could answer, movement near the edge of the crowd caught his eye. A hooded figure stood briefly between two supply wagons, almost hidden by smoke and rain. Unlike the overseers, this person wore no armor. Their face remained concealed, yet one gloved hand lifted slightly toward Baradan before disappearing back into the darkness beyond the campfires. The gesture lasted only a heartbeat. Still, Baradan felt certain it had been meant for him alone. The following days passed beneath mounting tension. Guards doubled along the camp perimeter, and labor gangs were searched morning and night for stolen tools or hidden weapons. Several workers vanished after interrogation and never returned. Yet despite the increased watchfulness, the sabotage continued. A loaded stone sled overturned upon a narrow ridge road after its wheel pins were removed. Water barrels intended for the upper camps turned foul overnight. Most troubling of all, sections of newly laid foundation cracked mysteriously after sunset, despite perfect craftsmanship. The overseers grew savage with frustration. Baradan saw men beaten unconscious for the smallest mistakes, while orc patrols descended into the tunnels beneath the towers carrying torches and hooks. Few returned smiling. Once, late at night, Screams echoed upward from the depths below the camp, and continued so long that even hardened workers covered their ears. Baradan tried to ignore the hidden signals and whispered rumors, yet curiosity gnawed steadily at him. He found himself watching shadows near the unfinished tunnels and listening for unusual sounds after dark. On the 6th night after the fire, as he carried chisels back toward the tool sheds, he noticed a small pile of stones beside the path, arranged in a deliberate pattern. 3 black stones beneath one pale stone. Nothing more. Yet he recognized at once that the arrangement was unnatural. He glanced around carefully. No guards stood nearby. Beyond the sheds, the cliffs rose steeply into darkness, broken only by scattered torchlight. Baradan hesitated, heart hammering in his chest. Then he nudged the pale stone aside with his boot. Beneath it lay a narrow strip of cloth wrapped around something metallic. He crouched quickly and concealed the object within his sleeve before any passing guard could notice. Only later, hidden in the trench beneath his blanket, did he unwrap it fully. Inside lay a small iron chisel of remarkable quality, far finer than the crude tools issued to common laborers. Around its handle, thin copper wire had been wound into the shape of a serpent, devouring its own tail. Naruz saw the object almost immediately, and went pale beneath the dim lantern glow. "Throw it away," he whispered sharply. "At once." Baradan frowned. "What is it?" The old carpenter stared toward the trench entrance before answering. "An invitation," he said softly. "And if you accept it, your life no longer belongs to you." Baradan slept little after finding the chisel. Each time his eyes closed, he saw again the hooded rider in the quarry, and those ember-bright eyes studying him from beneath the black cowl. The iron tool lay hidden beneath loose earth near his sleeping place, wrapped carefully inside a strip of cloth torn from his tunic. More than once during the night he considered throwing it into the trench fire before dawn, yet some stubborn instinct held his hand. It was not hope, exactly. Hope had little place in Mordor. Rather, it was the feeling that events had already begun moving around him like great stones rolling downhill, and to step aside now might prove just as deadly as continuing forward. Across the trench, Naruz watched him silently for a long while before finally speaking. "You are thinking too loudly," the old carpenter muttered. "A man survives here by making himself small." Baradan answered without looking up. "And has smallness saved you?" Naruz gave no reply after that. Morning came beneath a sky the color of old iron. Smoke drifted low across the camp, while horns summoned the labor gangs to their stations. Baradan spent the first half of the day cutting drainage channels beneath the eastern tower foundations, working knee-deep in freezing black water that seeped constantly through cracks in the volcanic rock. The work demanded precision. If the channels failed, rainwater and underground springs would weaken the lower masonry over time. Even the overseers understood this much, and so skilled workers were guarded closely in the trenches below the towers. Baradan labored in silence beside 3 other masons, while orc sentries watched from above with bows resting across their knees. Yet despite the scrutiny, his thoughts remained fixed upon the hidden chisel. He found himself studying every face around him, wondering who among the thousands in the camp might belong to the unseen rebels beneath the mountains. Near midday, a cry rose from the western works. Men stopped and turned. Along the ridge road descending from Udun came a new column entering the valley, far larger than the labor caravans before it. Heavy wagons creaked beneath loads of timber, iron plates, and massive chains thick as a man's wrist. Behind them marched fresh companies of orcs, carrying black banners marked with the red eye. But what drew every gaze was the machine rolling at the center of the convoy. It towered above the carts around it, a gigantic framework of dark wood and iron, bound together with chains and pulleys. Great counterweights hung from its sides like stone fists. "A gate lifter," whispered one mason beside Baradan. "By the gods!" Even from a distance, the size of the mechanism was monstrous. It would take hundreds of men merely to operate it. Baradan felt dread settle heavily in his stomach, for the arrival of such a machine meant the towers neared completion faster than anyone had expected. The convoy entered the camp to the sound of cracking whips and shouted orders. Overseers cleared the paths, while laborers were driven aside into the mud. Baradan glimpsed prisoners chained behind the wagons, many too weak even to lift their heads. Some wore remnants of armor from distant lands, south and east of Mordor. Others appeared scarcely more than boys. An orc captain rode past, laughing harshly at their stumbling pace. One prisoner collapsed outright near the drainage trench where Baradan worked. The guards dragged the man upright again, but his legs no longer obeyed him. Without hesitation, the captain drew a curved knife and cut the prisoner's throat before continuing onward, as though swatting aside an insect. Blood spread slowly across the ash-coated ground. The workers lowered their eyes and returned to labor at once. That evening, the camp buzzed with unease. Rumors spread that the Dark Lord himself would soon come openly to inspect the rising gate. Some claimed he already dwelt within Barad-dûr, far to the south, where foundations were said to be rising around Orodruin itself. Others whispered that the towers at Tirith Gorgor were only the first teeth of a far greater fortress, meant to choke all passage into Mordor forever. Baradan listened quietly, while men argued in hushed voices around the trench fires. At last, Naruz leaned close beside him. "The rebels will move soon," he said under his breath. "They know time grows short." Baradan glanced toward him sharply. "You speak as though you know them." "I know enough," Naruz answered. "Enough to fear them almost as much as the masters above us." Before Baradan could question him further, a horn sounded across the camp announcing curfew, and conversation died immediately. Later that night, Baradan woke to the sensation of someone gripping his ankle. Instinct nearly made him cry out, but a hand clamped over his mouth first. In the darkness beside him, Naruz whispered, "Quiet now. Listen carefully." The old carpenter pointed toward the far end of the trench, where moonlight leaked faintly through gaps in the roofing timbers. There, half hidden among sleeping bodies, a shadow moved slowly toward the exit. Baradan narrowed his eyes. It was a woman, wrapped in a dark cloak stained with mud and soot. No guard challenged her as she slipped outside. "How did she enter?" Baradan whispered, once the figure vanished. Naruz released him reluctantly. "Through places beneath the camp. She has come before." "Who is she?" The old man hesitated. "Her name is Eredwin. Once she worked the lower quarries. Now she leads those who escaped." Before Baradan could respond, Naruz rose carefully to his feet. "Come," he murmured. "If she risks entering the trench herself, something important has happened." They slipped quietly among the sleeping workers and emerged into the cold night air beyond. Clouds drifted low across the mountains, veiling the stars. The campfires had burned low, leaving most of the valley drowned in darkness, save for scattered watchtowers where orc sentries paced with spears in hand. Naruz led Baradan between supply sheds and stacks of timber until they reached a narrow crack in the cliffside, partly hidden by hanging canvas. Eredwin waited there with two other figures cloaked in grey-black wool. Up close, she appeared older than Baradan first expected, perhaps near 40 winters, though hardship had carved deeper years into her face. A jagged scar crossed one cheek from temple to jaw. Her eyes, however, remained sharp and fiercely alive. "So this is the Mason," she said quietly, studying Baradan without greeting. Her voice carried neither warmth nor fear. "You spoke truth to the Black One himself, and survived." Baradan stiffened. "I did not know who he was." Eredwen gave a thin smile. "You know now." One of the cloaked men shifted uneasily at the mention of Sauron, glancing toward the watchtowers as though expecting the darkness itself to overhear them. Narus folded his arms. "Why bring him here?" Eredwen answered without looking away from Baradan. "Because the foundations beneath the western tower still hide weaknesses. We need someone who understands the lower masonry." Baradan felt his pulse quicken. "You mean to sabotage the gate?" "We mean to stop it," Eredwen replied, "or delay it long enough that armies of the West may one day stand a chance against what is being built here." Baradan stared at her in disbelief. "Armies of the West?" he whispered. "No kingdom marches on Mordor." Eredwen stepped closer. "Not now. But power grows beyond these mountains as well. Gil-galad strengthens Lindon in the north. Númenórean ships sail farther east with every passing year. Sauron fears time, which is why he drives this labor so mercilessly." The name itself sounded dangerous, spoken aloud. Even the wind seemed to still briefly around them. Baradan shook his head slowly. "You cannot defeat him with broken cranes and burned supplies." "No," Eredwen admitted, "but stone remembers every flaw cut into it. A weak foundation may sleep for decades before it awakens." Her gaze sharpened. "You are a builder. You understand this." For several moments, Baradan said nothing. The cold air tasted of ash and rain. Somewhere far above, chains clanged against unfinished scaffolding as night crews continued labor beneath torchlight. "Why trust me?" he asked finally. Eredwen's expression darkened slightly. "We do not." She nodded toward the cloaked men beside her. 3 others watched you before the chisel was placed. Men under torment reveal themselves quickly here. Yet you have not informed the overseers." "Perhaps I simply fear the consequences," Baradan answered. "Fear keeps most men breathing," Eredwen said. "But breathing is not the same as living." Narus shifted impatiently. "Enough speeches. Tell him the truth." At this, Eredwen fell silent for a moment, before speaking more softly. "The gate lifter that arrived today carries the final iron hinges for the Morannon. Once those are mounted, the outer gates can be raised within months. We cannot allow that." A harsh cry echoed suddenly across the camp. All 4 froze. Torches flared near the southern watch line, where orc voices barked urgent commands. Another horn answered from the eastern ridge. Eredwen cursed beneath her breath. "Patrol change. We must move." She turned toward Baradan one last time. "Tomorrow night, 2nd watch. The collapsed tunnel beneath the northern tower." From beneath her cloak, she withdrew a small leather pouch and pressed it into his hand. Inside, he felt the weight of fine steel tools, sharper than anything issued in the camp. "If you come," she said quietly, "bring no one who fears chains more than slavery." Then she and the others slipped into the darkness behind the cliff crack, vanishing so swiftly that Baradan scarcely saw where they had gone. He and Narus returned separately to avoid suspicion. Back within the trench, Baradan sat awake long after the others resumed snoring around him. He turned the leather pouch over in his hands beneath the blanket, feeling the edges of chisels and wedges inside. The enormity of what had been offered settled upon him slowly. If discovered, death would come painfully and without delay. Yet another thought troubled him more deeply still. For the first time since entering Mordor, he had spoken with people who still believed the Dark Lord could be resisted. Dangerous madness, perhaps. Yet as Baradan listened to the endless hammering echoing through the mountains beyond the trench walls, he realized that madness possessed a strange strength of its own. The next day passed like a fever dream beneath smoke and iron noise. Baradan moved through his labor with the numb precision of habit, yet his thoughts never strayed far from the hidden tunnel beneath the northern tower. Every shouted order from the overseers sounded distant in his ears. Every clang of hammer upon stone seemed to count down the hours remaining before second watch. Around him, the construction of the Morannon advanced relentlessly. New scaffoldings climbed the sides of the twin towers, and gangs of chained laborers hauled iron plates towards the upper works, where blacksmiths riveted them into place with showers of sparks. The towers themselves had begun to resemble monstrous guardians crouched upon either side of the pass, their narrow windows like blind eyes gazing westward. Baradan hated the skill evident in the work. Whoever designed these fortifications understood war intimately. Every angle, every slope, every hidden murder hole had purpose. By midday, a dust storm rolled out of the eastern plain and swept through Cirith Gorgor with savage force. Ash and grit filled the air until the sun vanished entirely behind a red-black haze. Work did not stop. Overseers wrapped cloth across their faces and drove the laborers onward through the storm, while wind screamed between the mountains like living voices. Baradan spent hours hauling foundation stone across unstable ramps, slick with dust. Twice he nearly fell beneath the weight. Men coughed blood into the ash-choked air around him, while orcs lashed anyone who slowed. Yet amid the confusion, he noticed subtle movements passing quietly through the camp. Certain workers exchanged glances, too deliberate to be chance. One man dropped a hammer near a scaffold support and kicked it twice before retrieving it. Another tied a strip of red cloth briefly around his wrist before removing it again. Signals, small and fleeting. Baradan saw them now because he had been shown where to look. Toward evening, the storm finally weakened. A sickly red sunset bled across the western sky beyond the Eiffel Duath, while workers staggered back toward the trenches, half blinded with exhaustion. Baradan washed grit from his face at a water barrel near the quarry, when an unfamiliar voice spoke quietly beside him. The lower joints beneath the eastern tower are settling unevenly. He turned sharply. A thin man with a shaved head crouched nearby, filling a bucket, his expression blank. Baradan had seen him before among the stonecutters, but never spoken to him. "What?" Baradan asked cautiously. The man kept his eyes lowered. "The weight distribution is wrong. Another season of rain, and the stress fractures will widen." He lifted the bucket calmly. "You were right in the quarry." Then he walked away without another word. Baradan watched him disappear among the tents, pulse quickening uneasily. The rebels were larger than he had thought. Not a handful of fugitives hiding beneath the mountains, but a hidden network threaded quietly through the labor camps themselves. The realization frightened him more than before. A few escaped slaves might evade capture for years. A conspiracy within the camp would eventually draw Sauron's full wrath. That evening, as he returned to the trench, he found Narus repairing a cracked shovel handle near the entrance. The old carpenter glanced up once. "You have been noticed," he said quietly. Baradan crouched beside him. "How many are there?" Narus bound leather around the handle slowly before answering. "Enough to make the orcs nervous. Not enough to win." He looked toward the towers silhouetted against the darkening sky. But sometimes victory is not the same as survival. When second watch finally came, the camp had fallen mostly silent, save for distant forge fires and the endless groaning of cranes in the night wind. Clouds covered the moon entirely. Baradan slipped from the trench, carrying a sack of masonry tools to avoid suspicion if challenged. No guard stopped him. The labor camps sprawled chaotically across the valley floor, and movement after dark was common among night crews. Still, he kept to the shadows between supply sheds and unfinished walls, every nerve tight with anticipation. Once he heard boots approaching and flattened himself beneath a wagon, while 2 orc sentries passed close enough that he smelled stale blood upon their armor. Only after their torchlight vanished did he continue toward the northern tower. The collapsed tunnel entrance lay hidden behind stacked quarry stones near the tower foundation. At first, Baradan thought he had come alone. Then, a pebble clicked softly from the darkness ahead. He followed the sound carefully and found a narrow opening between the rubble where several stones had been removed since his last visit. A faint lantern glow flickered beyond. "Quickly," whispered Eredwin's voice from inside. Baradan squeezed through the gap sideways, scraping his shoulders against rough stone, and emerged into darkness, thick with damp heat. Someone replaced the outer stones immediately behind him. The hidden chamber beyond was larger than he expected, a natural cavern running deep beneath the foundations. About 20 people waited there in silence, beside covered lanterns and stacked supplies. Some he recognized from the labor gangs. Others were strangers hardened by years beneath the mountains. Eredwin stood near a crude table where charcoal sketches had been drawn across scraps of cloth. "You came," she said simply. Baradan glanced around uneasily. "If the guards discover this place, then we die," answered a broad-shouldered woman, sharpening iron spikes nearby. "That possibility was understood before you arrived." Several others gave quiet, grim laughs. The mood among them was not hopeful exactly, but fierce and stubborn, like trapped wolves refusing the hunter's leash. Eredwin gestured toward the cloth map spread across the table. "The Western Tower Foundation descends deeper than planned after your warning in the quarry. That delayed the work, but not enough." She pointed toward a series of tunnels marked beneath the tower base. "These old lava channels run directly beneath the lower masonry. If certain support stones fail during final construction, the weight of the upper walls may crack the entire foundation." Baradan studied the diagrams carefully. Despite the rough materials, the measurements were precise. Someone among the rebels understood engineering nearly as well as he did. "You mean to collapse the tower," he said slowly. "Not immediately," Eredwin replied. "Too obvious. The failure must appear natural." Another rebel, a gaunt man missing 2 fingers, leaned over the map. "If the Western Tower weakens years from now, perhaps during siege or earthquake, the gate becomes vulnerable." Baradan frowned deeply. "You are thinking too small. One damaged tower would not destroy the Morannon." "No," Eredwin admitted. "But it may wound it, delay armies, create openings." She met his gaze steadily. "In war, small weaknesses become graves." Baradan traced one rough tunnel line with his finger. "This channel here," he murmured. "It passes beneath the outer retaining wall." Several rebels looked at him sharply. He continued, thinking aloud. If water were redirected through the lower rock during winter freezes, pressure cracks would spread gradually upward through the foundation. The gaunt rebel nodded eagerly. "Yes, exactly." But Baradan shook his head. "No, it is not enough." He moved farther across the map toward the planned gate supports. "The true strain will come here, beneath the hinge mounts. The gates themselves will weigh more than siege towers. if those lower anchors weaken. Silence settled heavily over the cavern as the others followed his meaning. At last, Eredwin spoke softly. "Could it be done?" Baradan hesitated. Every instinct trained through years of masonry resisted the very thought. Builders preserved structures. They did not poison them from within. Yet these walls were being raised for darkness itself. Before he could answer, a distant sound echoed through the tunnels. Everyone froze instantly. It came again. Faint metal striking stone somewhere far below. One rebel extinguished 2 lanterns at once, while others reached for hidden knives and hammers. Eredwin motioned sharply for silence. The sound continued intermittently, slow and irregular. Clang. Silence. Clang. Baradan felt cold sweat along his spine. "Orcs?" he whispered. The broad-shouldered woman shook her head. "Too deep." No one seemed reassured by that answer. Even the hardened rebels exchanged uneasy glances. Naruz, who had remained near the tunnel entrance until now, muttered quietly. "The deep tunnels again." Baradan looked toward him. "What lives down there?" The old carpenter did not answer immediately. Then another sound drifted upward from the darkness beyond the cavern. Not metal this time. Breathing. It was enormous, slow and wet, like bellows dragging air through mud. The sound lasted only moments before fading again into silence, yet its memory lingered in the cavern long afterward. Several rebels made warding gestures against evil. One young worker near the wall had gone pale enough that Baradan thought he might faint outright. Eredwin's expression hardened instantly. "Lanterns out," she whispered. Darkness swallowed the cavern as flames vanished one by one. For several heartbeats, nobody moved. Baradan could hear only the distant dripping of underground water and the hammering of his own pulse. Then, from somewhere unimaginably deep beneath the mountains, came a low scraping sound, like stone dragging slowly across stone. The noise passed eventually. No attack came from the darkness below. Yet when the lanterns were relit, the mood inside the cavern had changed entirely. Fear lingered openly now. Eredwin rolled the maps together with tense movements. "We end tonight's council here," she said quietly. "Too much noise has carried through the lower channels already." One of the rebels protested softly, but she silenced him with a glance. Then she turned back toward Baradan. "You asked what lives beneath Mordor. We do not know fully. Old things. Creatures driven underground after the fall of Morgoth." Her scarred face tightened grimly. "Some tunnels were abandoned even by orcs long before we came." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "If you continue with us, you must understand this. Not all dangers in Mordor wear armor or carry whips." The meeting dispersed quickly afterward. Rebels vanished through narrow cracks and hidden passages branching deeper into the mountain, while others slipped back toward the camp above. At last, only Eredwin and Baradan remained near the tunnel entrance. She studied him carefully in the dim lantern glow. "You still have not answered," she said. "Can the gate be weakened?" Baradan looked upward instinctively, though hundreds of feet of stone separated them from the towers above. He imagined the vast weight already pressing downward into the mountain. The answer came reluctantly. "Yes," he said at last. "But if I do this, there will be no undoing it." Eredwin nodded once. "There has been no undoing any of this since the first stone was laid." Then she removed one of the outer rocks, sealing the passage toward the camp. Cold night air spilled inward through the crack. "Go now," she whispered, "and speak to no one of what you heard below." For days afterward, the sounds beneath the mountain haunted Baradan more deeply than the whips or screams above. During labor, his thoughts drifted constantly toward the hidden caverns below the foundations, where unseen things breathed in darkness older than the works of men. The rebels spoke little of those tunnels afterward, and when they did, it was always in lowered voices. Yet Mordor itself seemed built upon buried dread. Smoke rolled endlessly from Orodruin in the south, darkening the skies by day, while at night strange red glows flickered sometimes among distant ridges where no fires should have burned. Baradan began to understand that the Black Land was not merely ruled by terror, it was soaked in it. Even the stone carried memory here. Work on the Morannon accelerated with brutal speed. The great gate lifter was assembled between the towers beneath a forest of scaffolding and chains. Hundreds of laborers hauled its counterweights into position, while blacksmiths forged hinge pins thicker than a man's arm. Day and night, the sound of furnaces thundered through the valley. Rivers of molten iron poured into molds carved directly into the earth, throwing orange light across the camp and filling the air with the smell of burning charcoal and scorched flesh. Men collapsed from exhaustion beside the forges and were dragged away like broken tools. Baradan spent most of his hours below the western tower, measuring settlement cracks and reinforcing lower retaining walls under the watch of armed overseers. Each new layer of masonry brought the structure closer to completion, and with every passing day, the opportunity for sabotage narrowed. One evening, a labor gang attempted escape during a supply transfer near the Eastern Ridge Road. The attempt lasted less than an hour. Horns sounded across the valley, while mounted orcs swept through the ash plains, hunting the fugitives beneath torchlight. By dawn, the survivors had been captured and nailed alive to wooden stakes outside the camp perimeter as warning. Baradan passed them on his way to the foundations that morning. Most were already dead from exposure or blood loss, their faces grey with ash beneath the rising sun. One still breathed faintly. A young man no older than 20 turned cracked lips toward Baradan as he walked by. "Water," he whispered weakly. Baradan slowed despite himself, but an orc guard struck him hard across the back with a spear shaft. "Move!" He obeyed without looking back, yet shame followed him through the entire day like a shadow. That night, Eredwin summoned him again beneath the northern tower. This time, the rebel gathering was smaller and more tense than before. Two faces Baradan remembered from the earlier meeting were missing entirely. Others bore fresh bruises and cuts. A map of the lower foundations lay spread across the cavern floor, weighted with stones. Eredwin pointed toward the gate supports, carved into the mountain throat between the towers. "The hinge chambers are being sealed within 10 days, she said. After that, no one reaches the lower anchors again. Baradan crouched beside the map. Then the work must begin now. A murmur passed through the rebels. The gaunt man missing 2 fingers frowned deeply. "Too dangerous. The lower chambers swarm with guards." "Not at night," Baradan answered. "The overseers trust the weight of the unfinished gates to hold the support steady until final mounting. They do not yet fear sabotage there." Eredwin watched him closely. "You have a plan." Baradan hesitated. The thought itself sickened him, yet his mind had already solved the problem days earlier. "The hinge anchors are seated into natural volcanic shelves beneath the towers," he explained quietly. "If narrow stress fractures are cut deep enough behind the iron housings, pressure will spread gradually once the full gate weight settles." The rebels listened intently now. Baradan traced invisible lines across the stone map with one finger. "At first, nothing will happen, perhaps not for years, but eventually the lower supports will weaken. During siege or heavy impact, The hinges tear free, Eredwen finished softly, and the gates fail. Baradan nodded once. Silence settled heavily over the cavern. At last, the broad-shouldered woman who had spoken before let out a long breath. "Can such fractures remain hidden?" Baradan answered carefully. "If done properly. The cuts must follow natural seams in the rock. Any mistake will be seen immediately." Naruz leaned against the wall nearby, arms folded tightly. "And who performs this miracle of precision beneath the noses of orc guards?" "I do," Baradan said. Several rebels exchanged uneasy looks at once. Eredwen's scarred face hardened. "If you are captured, then I die," Baradan interrupted quietly. "That truth changes nothing." He surprised himself hearing the words spoken aloud. Somewhere along the road into Mordor, fear had ceased to matter in the same way it once had. Perhaps no man could stare long enough into darkness without surrendering some part of himself to it. Preparations began immediately. Over the next several nights, the rebels smuggled tools, wedges, and fine steel chisels into hidden caches beneath the western tower. Baradan continued his ordinary labor by day, while secretly studying guard rotations and work schedules near the hinge chambers. The lower passages were guarded less heavily after midnight, when forge crews changed shifts. Still, the risk remained enormous. The hinge chambers themselves lay directly beneath the central gate supports, where unfinished iron braces already waited for final mounting. Any tampering discovered there would bring swift execution upon hundreds. Yet despite the danger, Baradan noticed growing determination among the rebels. For the first time, they possessed not merely sabotage, but purpose. 3 nights before the planned operation, Sauron returned to the camp. The news spread before sunset, like fire racing through dry grass. Orc captains barked orders across the valley, while overseers forced laborers into ordered lines beside the unfinished gate. Torches were lit along the scaffolds and tower walls until the entire Morannon glowed red beneath the gathering darkness. Baradan stood among hundreds of exhausted workers facing the mountain pass, while cold wind swept ash across the plain. Then horns sounded from the northern ridge. A mounted procession emerged slowly from the shadows beyond Cirith Gorgor. Black-armored riders descended first, followed by companies of silent guards carrying long spears tipped with crimson flame. At their center rode the hooded figure Baradan remembered from the quarry. Even at a distance, the Dark Lord's presence seemed to bend the air around him. Silence spread outward through the valley as the riders approached, until only the crackle of torches and the grinding of chains from the gate-lifter remained audible. Sauron dismounted before the unfinished Morannon and stood gazing upward at the towers in stillness. His black cloak moved faintly in the wind. Baradan could not see his face clearly beneath the hood, yet he felt those terrible eyes sweeping across the assembled workers one by one. Fear moved through the crowd like an invisible current. Several men lowered themselves to their knees without command. Others trembled openly. Then Sauron spoke. "The work advances," he said, his voice deep as distant thunder beneath stone, yet not swiftly enough. No overseer answered. None dared. Sauron walked slowly toward the foundation trenches, while torchlight glimmered against black armor, hidden beneath his cloak. "The kingdoms of men grow restless beyond these mountains," he continued. "Elves gather strength in the west. Even Numenor stretches greedy hands toward lands that do not belong to them." His tone remained calm, but immense hatred coiled beneath the words. "They build ships and towers believing the elder days have ended. They believe darkness defeated." At this, he stopped beside one of the unfinished gate supports. A gloved hand rested upon the stone. "They are wrong." Baradan felt the weight of that voice deep in his bones. This was no mere tyrant of men. Something ancient and terrible stood before them, a being who remembered the wars of the First Age and carried their ruin still burning within him. Sauron turned then toward the assembled laborers. "You build the wall against chaos," he said. "The shield against those who would shatter order and claim dominion for themselves." Several overseers bowed deeply at the words. Baradan nearly recoiled in disbelief. The lie was monstrous, yet Sauron spoke it with such certainty that for a moment even hearing it unsettled the mind. "Serve well," the Dark Lord continued softly, "and your names shall endure within the foundations of a power that will outlast kingdoms." Then his gaze settled directly upon Baradan. The moment lasted only seconds, yet Baradan felt as though naked thoughts were being stripped from his mind. The fiery eyes beneath the hood narrowed slightly in recognition. Sauron stepped toward him through the ranks of workers. No one moved. No one breathed. "The Mason," the Dark Lord said quietly. "You advised truth in the quarry." Baradan forced himself to kneel with the others, though every instinct screamed against it. "I serve the works, Lord." A faint pause followed. Then Sauron spoke again, softer still. "See that you continue to do so." The words carried no threat openly, yet Baradan felt cold spread through his chest like poisoned water. The inspection ended soon afterward. Sauron departed toward the southern road with his black procession vanishing into the darkness beyond the towers. Only when the last torch disappeared did breath and noise slowly return to the valley. Workers stumbled back toward the trenches, whispering fearfully among themselves. Overseers seemed shaken as well, barking harsher orders than usual to conceal their unease. Baradan remained near the foundations longer than necessary, staring at the black stone where Sauron's hand had rested moments earlier. Naruz approached quietly beside him. "You should leave this place tonight," the old carpenter murmured. "Run if you can." Baradan gave a weary laugh. "Run where?" Naruz looked toward the mountains surrounding Mordor. No answer came. Later, beneath the hidden cavern, Eredwen listened grimly as Baradan recounted the encounter. The rebels sat in silence afterward, while water dripped steadily from the cavern roof into dark pools below. At last, Eredwen spoke. "He recognized you." "Perhaps," Baradan answered. "Or perhaps he recognizes every useful tool within his reach." The scarred woman studied him carefully. "Either way, we move tomorrow night. There can be no delay now." Around them, the rebels began checking blades, ropes, and chisels in silence. Beyond the cavern walls, the mountain groaned softly, as though ancient pressures shifted deep beneath the stone. And somewhere far below, hidden in the forgotten dark under Mordor, something answered with a slow breathing sound that never fully seemed to stop. The night chosen for the sabotage arrived beneath a moonless sky. Thick clouds rolled low over Mordor, swallowing even the faint red glow that usually lingered above Orodruin in the south. Wind hissed through the unfinished battlements of the Morannon, while chains creaked softly against the towering gate-lifter, standing between the twin towers like some slumbering beast of iron and timber. Baradan moved through the camp with a laborer's sack slung over one shoulder and his head lowered against the cold. Around him, night crews hauled stone and coal beneath scattered torchlight, too exhausted to notice another weary worker crossing the valley. Yet every shadow seemed sharper than before. Every distant footstep sent tension through his limbs. By dawn, either the foundations of the Black Gate would carry a hidden wound within them, or he and the rebels would hang from the towers they had helped build. Near the northern tower, a pulley crane had jammed deliberately earlier that evening, creating confusion among the work gangs. Orc overseers cursed and shouted while crews struggled to clear the tangled chains. The distraction allowed small groups of rebels to slip quietly toward their assigned positions beneath the works. Baradan reached the hidden tunnel entrance shortly after second watch. Eredwin waited there beside 4 others cloaked in soot-dark wool. No one wasted words. They descended immediately through narrow passages, lit only by shuttered lanterns, whose dim glow barely touched the dripping walls. Heat thickened steadily the deeper they traveled. Soon the air smelled strongly of sulfur and hot stone. Far above, muffled through layers of rock, came the distant grinding of machinery from the surface works. The hinge chambers lay deeper than Baradan expected. The tunnels twisted downward through ancient lava channels, blackened smooth by fires older than memory. In some places, the walls bore strange glassy surfaces that reflected lantern light in warped crimson streaks. The rebels moved carefully, pausing often to listen for patrols or shifting stone. More than once, Baradan heard sounds beyond the tunnel walls that he could not explain. Soft scraping, faint echoes like distant murmuring voices. Once something moved briefly at the edge of the lantern, glow far down a side passage before vanishing entirely. Nobody spoke of it. The deeper tunnels carried their own silence, heavy and watchful, and even Eredwin seemed eager to pass through them quickly. At last they reached the lower hinge chamber, beneath the western tower. Baradan stopped despite himself upon entering. The scale of the construction was staggering. Massive iron anchor braces descended from the ceiling into carved stone housings larger than cottages, each fixed deep within the mountain bedrock to bear the future weight of the gates above. Thick chains hung motionless through vertical shafts leading upward toward the unfinished hinges. The entire chamber thrummed faintly with pressure from the enormous structures already resting overhead. Moisture dripped steadily along the walls, collecting in shallow channels cut through the floor to divert underground water away from the foundations. "By all the gods," whispered one rebel softly, "it is like standing beneath a mountain prepared to fall." Baradan forced himself to focus. He knelt beside the nearest anchor housing and ran his fingers along the stone seams beneath the iron mountings. The work was extraordinary. Whoever designed the supports understood both masonry and warcraft beyond ordinary skill. The natural volcanic shelf beneath the tower had been carved and shaped into interlocking pressure points meant to distribute immense weight evenly through the surrounding rock. Any obvious damage here would be noticed immediately during final inspections. Yet after long moments of study, Baradan found what he sought. Thin natural fault lines ran deep beneath the lower braces, where heat and cooling ages ago had weakened the stone invisibly from within. Small flaws, almost nothing, but enough. He looked up toward Eredwin. "Lantern covers," he murmured. "No sparks." At once the rebels dimmed the lights further until the chamber rested in near darkness. Baradan removed the fine steel tools from his sack and pressed one narrow chisel carefully into the first hidden seam. Then he struck it lightly with a hammer. The sound rang softly through the chamber. Everyone froze. For several breaths they listened in silence. No alarm came from above. No orc voices echoed down the shafts. Baradan exhaled slowly and struck again, this time more carefully. Tiny fractures spread inward through the volcanic shelf beneath the iron brace, invisible except to a trained eye. The work demanded terrifying precision. Too shallow, and the damage would fail to matter. Too deep, and the support might crack immediately beneath the unfinished weight overhead, burying them all alive. Sweat ran cold along Baradan's back despite the heat. Beside him, Eredwen knelt, watching the tunnel entrances, while the others stood ready with wedges and tools. Time narrowed into hammer blows and measured breaths. They had worked perhaps an hour when the first disaster came. A distant horn sounded faintly from somewhere above the tunnels. Every rebel looked upward instinctively. Another horn answered closer this time. Then came shouting, muffled but unmistakable through the stone shafts overhead. Eredwen cursed under her breath. "Patrols!" Baradan kept working. "Not for us yet." Yet unease spread quickly through the chamber. The horns continued intermittently, while heavy vibrations trembled faintly through the ceiling stones above. Something unusual was happening on the surface. One rebel moved toward the tunnel entrance to scout ahead, but before he reached it, a scream echoed distantly through the lower passages behind them. It was not a human scream. The sound rose shrill and ragged from somewhere deep beneath the foundations, followed by the unmistakable clash of weapons and frantic shouting in the black speech. Orc voices. More screams followed, closer now. Then silence crashed down abruptly once again. No one moved. The rebels stared into the dark tunnels beyond the chamber, where the lantern glow failed entirely. Baradan felt the tiny hairs rise along his arms. "What is happening?" whispered the broad-shouldered woman. Eredwen shook her head slowly, face pale beneath the soot. "Something has reached the patrols below." Another sound drifted faintly upward then. Wet scraping, heavy breathing, closer than before. "Finish the fractures," Eredwen snapped suddenly, forcing motion back into the frozen group. "Now!" Baradan bent again to the stone, striking faster this time. Fine cracks spread deeper behind the anchor brace, exactly as intended. Already he could feel slight shifts in pressure through the chisel head, subtle weaknesses awakening within the shelf beneath the support. Another 10 minutes, perhaps, and the damage would be complete. Around him, the rebels worked hurriedly, placing wedges and masking stone dust beneath loose debris so inspections would reveal nothing unusual. Yet the sounds in the lower tunnels continued drawing nearer. Once Baradan glimpsed movement far beyond the chamber entrance, something large slipping briefly between columns of darkness where no torchlight reached. Then came running footsteps. An orc burst into the hinged chamber from the lower passage, armor splashed dark with blood. He froze upon seeing the rebels. For one heartbeat, both sides stared at one another in shock. Then the orc opened its mouth to shout. Eredwen's knife struck first. The blade buried itself in the creature's throat. The orc staggered backward, choking, while another rebel lunged forward and dragged it silently to the ground. Blood spread rapidly across the stone floor. Baradan stared in horror. The chamber suddenly seemed much smaller than before. Eredwen ripped her knife free and hissed, "We leave, now!" "Not yet," Baradan answered sharply. He struck the chisel twice more into the deepest seam. A low crack murmured through the stone beneath the anchor housing like distant thunder. The pressure shift settled instantly afterward, subtle but irreversible. Baradan knew then the floor had taken hold. A roar erupted from the lower tunnels. The sound shook dust from the chamber ceiling. It was deep and raw, filled with animal fury unlike anything human. More orc screams followed, cut short almost immediately. One rebel backed away in terror. "Move!" Eredwen shouted. Lanterns were snatched up, tools abandoned. The group fled toward the upper tunnels, just as something crashed heavily against stone, somewhere behind them in the darkness below. They ran blindly through twisting passages, while echoes thundered after them. Baradan heard scraping claws against rock, heard breathing close enough now to vibrate through the tunnel walls. Twice they nearly lost the path in branching lava channels, where ancient heat vents filled the air with choking steam. At one narrow crossing, the gaunt rebel, missing 2 fingers, slipped upon wet stone and vanished screaming into a fissure below before anyone could catch him. His cries echoed upward for several seconds, then ended abruptly. Nobody stopped. Fear drove them onward faster than exhaustion ever could. At last, faint torchlight appeared ahead, marking the upper tunnels beneath the northern tower. Relief surged through the fleeing rebels. Then an alarm horn exploded directly overhead. Orcs poured into the upper passage from the campsite entrance. Black arrows hissed through the darkness. One rebel collapsed instantly with a shaft buried through his chest. The tunnel erupted into chaos. Eredwin shouted for the others to split apart, while orc guards charged forward with spears and hooked blades. Baradan ducked against the wall as steel clashed wildly in the confined passage. Someone shoved a hammer into his hand. An orc lunged toward him, snarling. Instinct alone saved him. He swung blindly. The hammer crushed against the creature's jaw with sickening force, sending it sprawling backward into the tunnel wall. Then all sound vanished beneath a deeper roar rising from below. Every combatant froze. From the lower darkness behind, the rebels came a shape vast enough to fill the tunnel entirely. Baradan saw only fragments in the torchlight. Slick black limbs, pale clustered eyes glimmering wetly, and a mouth opening far too wide beneath folds of twitching flesh. The creature surged forward with horrifying speed. Orcs screamed. Torches scattered. The tunnel dissolved into madness. Baradan heard Eredwin shouting somewhere ahead, but the monster's roar drowned everything beneath it as darkness and blood swallowed the passage whole. Baradan ran without knowing where his feet carried him. Behind him, the tunnel shook with screams and crashing stone, while torchlight flared wildly against the walls. Men and orcs alike scattered before the thing surging upward from the deep passages. In the chaos, distinctions vanished completely. Fear ruled everything now. Baradan glimpsed pale limbs thrashing through the darkness behind him. Too many limbs, slick and jointed wrong like some monstrous spider swollen to impossible size. One orc vanished screaming into the creature's grasp as it struck from the shadows with terrifying speed. Another fired arrows blindly into the darkness before being dragged backward out of sight. Baradan forced himself not to look again. The sound alone was enough. The surviving rebels fled upward through the branching tunnels beneath the northern tower. Eredwin led them ahead with a stolen orc torch, while black smoke from overturned lanterns rolled through the confined passages behind. Baradan stumbled beside Naruz over uneven stone slick with moisture and blood. Somewhere farther ahead, one of the rebels sobbed openly as they ran. The old carpenter grabbed Baradan's sleeve sharply. "Faster!" he rasped. "The upper patrols will seal the exit soon." Another roar echoed behind them, closer now, followed by a violent crunch of stone collapsing somewhere in the darkness below. Dust burst through the tunnel like breath from a giant furnace. Whatever hunted beneath Mordor was not merely killing the orc patrols, it was tearing through the mountain itself. At the next junction, Eredwin halted abruptly and thrust the torch toward a narrow fissure hidden behind fallen rocks. "This way," she hissed. The opening barely looked large enough for a grown man. One by one, the rebels squeezed sideways into the crack, while shouts and clanging armor echoed nearer through the main tunnel behind them. Baradan scraped painfully through jagged volcanic stone before tumbling into another hidden passage beyond. The air there felt colder and far older than the tunnels above. Ancient carvings covered sections of the walls, worn almost smooth by time and heat. Baradan touched one briefly while catching his breath. The shape resembled twisted stars or burning eyes, surrounded by lines of flowing script, unlike any language he knew. "What is this place?" he whispered. Eredwin's face looked grim in the dim torchlight. "Older than Sauron's works. Orcs avoid it." They moved deeper into the forgotten passage, while distant battle noises faded gradually behind them. The tunnel sloped downward again, despite their efforts to climb higher, twisting through natural caverns threaded with narrow streams of black water. Here and there, old stone pillars appeared, carved directly into the mountain itself, remnants perhaps of some ancient stronghold, buried long before the rise of Mordor. Baradan sensed enormous age pressing around them from every side. Even the air tasted stale and untouched. Narus walked heavily beside him, breathing harder with every step. "We cannot wander forever," the old carpenter muttered. "These tunnels have no end." Eredwin did not slow. "There is another route to the surface, farther west." One of the remaining rebels shook his head fearfully. "No, not through the lower halls." Eredwin rounded on him sharply. "Would you rather face orc patrols above?" Before anyone answered, a faint noise drifted through the darkness ahead. Breathing. The rebels froze instantly. It came not from behind this time, but somewhere deeper within the tunnel before them. Slow, wet, enormous. Baradan felt his stomach tighten into ice. The torchlight flickered uneasily, as though disturbed by unseen movement beyond its reach. "There is more than one," whispered the broad-shouldered woman beside him. Nobody contradicted her. For several moments they stood motionless, listening to the breathing echo softly through the buried halls. Then, from far behind, came the renewed sound of orc horns searching the upper tunnels. Eredwin cursed softly under her breath. "Forward," she whispered. "Carefully now." They advanced with weapons drawn through narrowing corridors where the ceiling dipped low enough to force them hunched nearly double. Strange white fungi clung to cracks in the stone, emitting faint, corpse-pale glows that mingled sickly with the torchlight. Baradan's nerves stretched tighter with every step. Several times he thought he glimpsed movement in side passages, only for darkness to swallow it again. At last, the tunnel widened abruptly into a cavern vast enough that the torchlight could not reveal its ceiling. The rebels halted at the edge, in stunned silence. Ruins filled the cavern floor. Broken columns lay toppled among cracked stairways descending into black water pools. Fragments of ancient walls emerged from the darkness, draped in thick strands of pale webbing. Great archways carved with symbols long forgotten rose crookedly along the cavern edges, their stones melted and warped as though touched by terrible heat ages ago. Baradan stared in awe despite the danger surrounding them. "Who built this?" he murmured. Narus shook his head slowly. "No men." The old carpenter's voice sounded very small within the cavern. "Perhaps not even orcs." Eredwin lifted the torch higher, illuminating a massive stone relief upon one wall, depicting horned figures bowing before a towering shape crowned in flame. "Servants of Morgoth," she said quietly, "from the elder days." A sound interrupted her. Soft clicking echoed across the cavern. The rebels spun toward the darkness beyond the ruined columns. The clicking came again, joined now by faint scraping movements across stone. Baradan saw the broad-shouldered woman tighten her grip upon her spear. "Torches higher," Eredwin ordered. Flames rose shakily. For several heartbeats, nothing moved. Then pale eyes appeared among the ruins. Dozens of them. They glimmered wetly from cracks in the darkness, between broken pillars and hanging webs. Small at first glance, until several blinked sideways instead of forward. Then shapes emerged slowly into the light. Creatures the size of wolves crawled over the stones on long segmented limbs, their swollen bodies pale as rotting flesh beneath clusters of black eyes. Baradan recoiled instinctively. Giant spiders, their clicking jaws worked hungrily as they crept nearer through the ruins. One rebel gave a terrified cry. Spawn of Ungoliant. The creatures answered with shrill hissing sounds that echoed through the cavern. Back, Eredwin snapped, slowly. But retreat came too late. The spiders rushed them all at once. The cavern exploded into chaos. Spears thrust wildly, while torches swung through the darkness, scattering sparks across ancient stone. One spider leapt onto a rebel's chest, driving him backward beneath twitching legs before its jaws plunged into his throat. Another sprang from above onto the cavern wall beside Baradan, claws scraping inches from his face. He smashed it aside with his hammer and heard its body crack against the rocks, yet more swarmed through the ruins immediately afterward. Narus fought beside him with a broken spear haft, cursing breathlessly, while pale webs tangled around their legs. The creatures moved with horrifying speed, striking and retreating among the columns faster than the torchlight could follow. Then a deeper hiss rolled through the cavern. The smaller spiders scattered instantly aside. From the darkness beyond, the ruins emerged something far larger. Baradan saw first the eyes, a cluster of pale globes gleaming high above the broken columns. Then came the limbs, immense black legs unfolding slowly from the shadows one after another, until the creature towered over the ruined stairways like a living nightmare. Thick webs draped across its swollen body. Its jaws clicked wetly as strands of saliva stretched between curved fangs longer than daggers. Several rebels froze outright at the sight. The monstrous spider lowered itself slowly toward them through the darkness, and Baradan suddenly understood why even orcs feared the deep tunnels beneath Mordor. "Run!" Eredwin shouted. The rebels broke apart immediately. Some fled back toward the tunnels, while others scrambled desperately through the ruins seeking another escape. The giant spider surged forward with terrifying speed despite its size. Stone shattered beneath its limbs as it struck. One rebel disappeared beneath its body screaming, while webs exploded across the cavern floor. Baradan grabbed Narus by the arm and dragged him toward a half-collapsed archway near the cavern wall. Eredwin appeared beside them, slashing through strands of webbing with a knife. "There!" she shouted, pointing toward a narrow stairway descending beneath the ruins. They plunged downward, just as the giant spider crashed against the arch behind them. Ancient stones collapsed inward with a deafening roar, burying the entrance beneath rubble. Dust billowed through the darkness. For several moments, nobody moved. Then silence returned, save for muffled scraping sounds somewhere above the fallen stones. Baradan bent over, gasping for breath. Beside him, Narus had sunk heavily against the wall, clutching his side. Dark blood stained the old carpenter's tunic, where one of the smaller spiders had struck him. Eredwin knelt beside him immediately. "Let me see." Narus pushed her hand away weakly. "No time." The hidden stairway led into a narrow chamber, carved directly beneath the ruins above. Ancient stone benches lined the walls around a circular pit at the room's center, filled with black ash untouched for ages. Strange runes covered the ceiling in fading crimson paint. Baradan looked around uneasily while Eredwin checked the blocked entrance. "Will the spiders break through?" he asked quietly. She listened to the muffled scraping overhead before answering. Not quickly, yet her expression revealed little comfort. Naruz breathed heavily against the wall nearby, his skin already pale beneath the grime. "Venom," he muttered. "I can feel it." Baradan crouched beside him. "We will get you out." The old carpenter gave a weak laugh. "Out where?" He coughed painfully before continuing. "Listen to me now. The fractures beneath the hinged chamber. Did you finish them?" Baradan nodded slowly. Relief flickered briefly across Naruz's exhausted face. "Good. Then perhaps this was worth the price after all." Eredwin looked away grimly toward the sealed entrance, while faint scratching sounds continued above them through the stone. Somewhere in the buried darkness beyond the chamber, the monstrous children of Ungoliant still hunted the forgotten halls beneath Mordor. And far overhead, unseen beyond miles of rock, the black gate continued rising stone by stone beneath the will of Sauron. Naruz worsened quickly. Within the hidden chamber beneath the ruins, his breathing grew shallow and uneven, while dark veins spread slowly upward from the spider bite beneath his ribs. The old carpenter sat against the stone wall, wrapped in a cloak one of the rebels had given him, though sweat still gleamed upon his brow despite the cold air underground. Baradan knelt nearby, watching helplessly, while Eredwin examined the wound beneath the flickering torchlight. "The venom is deep," she said, quietly at last. "If we had clean herbs or fire enough to cauterize—" She stopped before finishing. There was no need. They all understood. Around them, the surviving rebels rested in exhausted silence, listening to the faint scraping sounds that still drifted now and then through the blocked entrance above. The spiders had not left the ruins. Baradan rose and crossed slowly toward the circular ash pit at the center of the chamber. Ancient soot coated the stones thickly there, untouched for ages beyond counting. He crouched and brushed part of it aside with one hand. Beneath lay fragments of burned bone. Human, perhaps, or something close enough to human that the difference no longer mattered. He stared into the pit uneasily, while distant memories stirred from old tales heard in childhood beside the Sea of Rune. Stories of Morgoth's servants worshipping in hidden fire temples beneath the mountains of the world. Suddenly the carvings on the walls around him seemed less like ruins and more like scars left by forgotten evil. Eredwin joined him quietly. "This was once a shrine," she murmured. "To whom?" Baradan asked. The scarred woman looked toward the fading crimson runes overhead, perhaps to Sauron himself, before the downfall of Morgoth. He was feared as a god among many men in those days. The thought unsettled Baradan deeply. Until entering Mordor, he had imagined evil as something loud and obvious, carried by armies and iron banners. Yet beneath the mountains, he had begun to understand another truth. Darkness endured because people built places for it. They carved halls, raised towers, offered obedience one stone at a time until fear itself became architecture. The Morannon was not merely a fortress. It was the continuation of something ancient that had survived the ruin of ages. Baradan looked toward the blocked stairway, where dust still drifted faintly through the cracks. "If Sauron completes the gate," he said softly, "this land will never stop spreading outward." Eredwin's expression hardened. That is why the foundations matter. Several hours passed, while the rebels rested in uneasy shifts. No one dared sleep fully. Once the giant spider struck violently against the buried entrance above, shaking loose stones from the ceiling and sending panic through the chamber. But the rubble held. Eventually, even the scratching noises faded into distant silence. Naruz drifted in and out of fevered consciousness beside the wall. At times he muttered broken fragments of memory from his youth, speaking of cedar forests near the inland seas and bright marketplaces filled with music before the wars and slave raids came eastward. Baradan sat with him through much of the darkness, listening quietly. "I had sons once," Naruz whispered suddenly during one waking spell. "2 of them." Baradan looked up sharply. The old carpenter gave a weak smile. "Strong boys, always climbing rooftops they were forbidden to climb." His eyes clouded briefly. "I do not know if they live still." Baradan found he could think of no answer worthy of the grief in those words. At last, Naruz gripped his wrist weakly. "Listen carefully now," he rasped. "When you reach the surface again, leave Mordor if you can. Do not become trapped fighting shadows forever." Baradan frowned. "You fought." "No," Naruz whispered. "I survived. There is a difference." Before Baradan could respond, a sharp cry came from the far side of the chamber. One of the rebels had discovered another passage hidden behind collapsed stone near the rear wall. Eredwin seized a torch and hurried over at once. The narrow opening descended steeply into darkness, where stale, cold air drifted upward. "A ventilation shaft, perhaps," she murmured. "Or an old escape route." The broad-shouldered woman beside her peered downward uneasily. "Or another nest." There was little choice. Remaining in the chamber meant eventual death, whether by spiders, orc patrols, or starvation. So the rebels gathered their remaining tools and prepared to descend through the newly opened passage. Naruz could no longer walk unaided. Baradan and another rebel lifted him carefully between them, while Eredwin led the way downward into the unknown shaft below. The tunnel twisted sharply through ancient volcanic stone, slick with moisture. In several places they were forced to squeeze sideways through gaps barely wider than shoulders while carrying the weakened carpenter. The air gradually cooled as they descended farther from the heat of the upper tunnels. Yet beneath the chill, another smell lingered faintly now. Fresh air. Very distant, but real. Hope stirred quietly among the survivors. The shaft eventually widened into a natural cavern, where underground water flowed black and swift through a narrow channel. Pale roots dangled from the ceiling overhead, reaching downward from forests far above the mountain rock. Baradan stared upward in disbelief. "We are near the western slopes," he said. Eredwin nodded cautiously. "If the roots reach this deep, the surface cannot be far." The rebels followed the underground stream through winding passages, while the sound of running water echoed softly around them. Several times Baradan thought he glimpsed faint grey light ahead, only for another bend in the cavern to swallow it again. Yet the smell of clean air grew steadily stronger. Even Naruz seemed to sense it. "Trees," he murmured weakly. "I remember trees." At last, the cavern opened abruptly onto a narrow crack overlooking the western side of the Eiffel Duath. Cold night wind rushed inward, carrying the scent of rain and distant pine forests beyond the mountains. The rebels emerged carefully onto a steep ledge halfway down the western cliffs. For a long moment, nobody spoke. After endless weeks beneath ash and smoke, the sight before them seemed almost unreal. Far below, the dark lands of Ithilien stretched beneath scattered moonlight, silver rivers winding through forests untouched by Mordor's blight. Clouds drifted slowly across the stars overhead. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called softly through the night. Baradan breathed the clean air deeply and felt something inside him ache with sudden longing so sharp it nearly became pain. But the moment didn't last. A horn sounded faintly from the eastern side of the mountains behind them. Then another answered farther north. Eredwen turned immediately toward the hidden crack. "Search parties," she said grimly. "They know rebels escaped the tunnels." One of the surviving rebels slumped against the cliff in despair. "We cannot outrun mounted orcs carrying our wounded." Eredwen's gaze moved toward Narus. The old carpenter understood at once. "No," Baradan said sharply, before anyone spoke further. "We leave together." Narus smiled sadly. "You still think like a free man." He gripped Baradan's forearm with trembling fingers. "Listen to me now. I will slow you all." "Then we slow," Baradan answered. But Eredwen remained silent, her face hard with terrible calculation. Before the argument could deepen, movement flickered far below upon the western slopes. Several riders emerged briefly between the trees beneath moonlight. Not orcs. Their armor gleamed silver gray, and long cloaks flowed behind them as they moved swiftly through the forest paths below the mountains. Elves. Even at this distance, their bearing was unmistakable. The rebels stared downward in stunned silence while the riders paused near a stream far beneath the cliffside. One figure dismounted and looked slowly toward the dark mountains towering above. Though impossibly distant, Baradan somehow felt the weight of that gaze searching the heights of Mordor. Eredwen exhaled softly. Scouts from the west? Hope flickered across several exhausted faces, yet just as quickly it faded again. The cliff remained too steep to descend quickly, and already distant torchlights were appearing along the eastern ridges behind them. The search had begun. Eredwen turned back toward the group decisively. "We split here. Smaller numbers travel farther." One rebel protested immediately, but she silenced him. "The wounded go westward with Baradan and me. The rest scatter through the lower slopes." Her eyes moved toward the dark forests beyond the mountains. "If any survive, carry word of Mordor's strength to every free land that will listen." No one argued further after that. Quiet farewells passed between companions who knew they might never meet again beneath any sky. As the rebels prepared to descend the narrow western paths, Narus suddenly caught Baradan's sleeve once more. His face had grown pale as old parchment now, his breathing ragged. "One more thing," he whispered. Baradan leaned closer. "The gate." The old carpenter coughed painfully before continuing. "You wounded it deeply?" Baradan nodded slowly. Narus closed his eyes in relief. "Good," he murmured. "Then even darkness may bleed." Those were the last clear words he spoke before fever finally claimed him completely. Above them, beyond the mountains of shadow, the unfinished Morannon still stood black against the eastern sky, while fires burned red around its rising towers. But hidden deep beneath its foundations, invisible to every overseer and servant of Sauron, the first true weakness had already begun to spread through the stone. Dawn crept slowly across the western slopes of the Ephel Duath, pale and cold beneath drifting rain clouds. Baradan descended the narrow mountain paths beside Eredwen, while two surviving rebels carried the fevered form of Narus between them upon a rough litter made from broken spear shafts and cloaks. Behind them, Mordor still smoldered beneath the dark horizon. Even from the western ridges, the red glow of Orodruin stained the distant sky like an open wound. Baradan looked back only once. The twin towers of the Morannon stood visible through the mountain pass, unfinished, yet already terrible. Black shapes rising above the ash plains with cranes and scaffoldings clinging to their sides like webs upon dead trees. Thin banners snapped in the wind atop the towers. the Black Gate would be completed. Of that, there was now little doubt. The descent proved brutal. The hidden paths twisting through the mountains were ancient and treacherous, known perhaps only to smugglers, wandering hunters, and desperate fugitives fleeing Mordor's grasp. Rain turned the narrow ledges slick beneath their boots, while loose stones rattled endlessly into unseen depths below. Several times they were forced to hide among cliff shadows, as orc search patrols passed along higher ridges, carrying torches and hunting horns. Once Baradan heard wargs howling somewhere eastward, beyond the mountains, their cries echoing horribly through the passes. Yet the western lands slowly unfolded below them, with every mile gained. Green valleys appeared between the hills. Streams flashed silver beneath the morning light. After so long beneath Mordor's ash-dark skies, even the scent of wet grass seemed strange and overwhelming. Naruz died before noon. The old carpenter's breathing had weakened steadily through the descent, until at last it simply stopped beside a cold mountain spring shaded by bent pine trees. No final speech came. No dramatic farewell. One moment he struggled faintly against the venom burning through him, and the next his weathered face grew still at last. The surviving rebels stood in silence around the body, while rain whispered softly through the branches overhead. Baradan knelt beside the spring, staring down at the man who had walked beside him since the slave caravans first entered Mordor. He found himself remembering small things instead of grand ones. Naruz laughing bitterly beside the trench fires, Naruz muttering over broken tools beneath the towers, Naruz warning him to remain small and unnoticed. Strange how quickly a life narrowed itself into fragments once it ended. "We cannot bury him deeply," Eredwin said quietly after a long silence. "The patrols are close behind." Baradan nodded without speaking. Together they laid Naruz beneath a cairn of mountain stones beside the spring. Baradan placed the old carpenter's worn hammer beneath the rocks before the grave was sealed. It seemed wrong somehow that a builder should lie empty-handed beneath the earth. When the cairn was finished, Eredwin rested one hand briefly upon the stones. "He endured longer than most," she murmured. "That matters." Then the rebels continued westward once more, leaving the grave alone among the mountain pines, where clean water flowed endlessly down toward Ithilien, far below. By evening they reached the lower forests. Tall beeches and cedar trees spread across the hillsides there, untouched by Mordor's poison, save for distant smoke lingering along the eastern horizon. Birds moved through the branches overhead. Real birds. Their songs startled Baradan almost painfully after the endless silence and screams of the Black Land. Yet danger still followed close behind. Twice the rebels discovered fresh orc tracks, crossing the woodland streams nearby. Search riders had descended from the mountains faster than expected. Eredwin led the survivors carefully westward through hidden game trails, while darkness gathered beneath the trees. "There is an old refuge ahead," she said softly. A place used by traders once before, Mordor's borders closed entirely. One rebel glanced nervously toward the eastern hills. "And if the orcs reach it first?" Eredwin's expression hardened. "Then we keep running." Night fell fully before they found the refuge. It stood hidden within a narrow ravine, overgrown with ivy and thorn bushes, little more than the crumbling remains of an ancient watchpost from forgotten wars. Yet fresh embers smoldered faintly within the ruined hearth. The rebels froze instantly. Someone else had arrived before them. Eredwin motioned sharply for silence, while the survivors spread cautiously around the ruin with knives and stolen orc blades drawn. Baradan moved beside a moss-covered wall, heart hammering once more. For a moment, only wind stirred through the ravine. Then a calm voice spoke from the shadows near the hearth. "You are pursued." The speaker stepped slowly into the firelight. An elf stood there, cloaked in grey and green, tall and lean as a young birch tree. Silver glimmered faintly along the edges of his armor beneath the cloak, while a long knife rested sheathed at one hip beside an unstrung bow. Two more elves emerged silently from the darkness behind him. Their movements carried no sound at all. Baradan stared in stunned silence. Never before had he stood so near one of the firstborn. The elf studying them seemed ancient beyond guessing, yet his face remained untouched by age in any mortal sense. His eyes lingered upon the exhausted fugitives and the blood staining their clothes. "You come from Mordor," he said, quietly. It was not a question. Eredwen lowered her blade cautiously. "And you watch its borders." "We do," the elf answered. "Though too little now." His gaze shifted toward Baradan. "The towers rise quickly." Baradan hesitated before speaking. "You know of the gate?" A shadow crossed the elf's face then, subtle but unmistakable. "For many years we have watched smoke gathering in the Black Land. Now, at last, the shape of Sauron's strength reveals itself openly." Hearing the Dark Lord's name spoken beneath open stars, rather than whispered in tunnels, felt strange beyond words. The elf stepped nearer the firelight. "I am Mythor of the Woodland Realm," he said. "Scouts of Gil-galad ride these lands more often now." Eredwen exchanged a sharp glance with Baradan at the mention of the High King in the west. The rebels were given food and water beside the ruined hearth, while the elves listened carefully to all that had happened beneath Mordor. Baradan spoke longest, describing the rising towers, the labor camps, the gate lifter, and finally, the hidden fractures carved beneath the western hinge supports. The elves listened without interruption. Only once did Mythor visibly react, when Baradan described the ancient tunnels and monstrous spiders beneath the mountains. "Children of Ungoliant endure there still," the elf murmured grimly. "We feared as much." When the tale ended, silence settled heavily around the fire. At last, Mythor looked eastward, beyond the ravine, where distant red light stained the horizon above Mordor. "The shadow grows faster than our lords believed," he said softly. "This news must reach Lindon swiftly." One of the rebels leaned forward anxiously. "Will the West act?" Mythor's expression remained unreadable in the firelight. Elves remember the ruin of the elder days. Men remember less. He glanced toward Baradan. "But Sauron does not build gates for peace." The words lingered heavily after he spoke them. Somewhere beyond the forest, an owl cried softly through the darkness, while rain drifted among the trees. Baradan found himself suddenly exhausted beyond measure, not merely from escape or fear, but from the crushing understanding that the Morannon was only the beginning. If Sauron gathered strength openly now, greater wars would surely follow. Before dawn the next morning, the elves prepared to depart westward, carrying news of Mordor to their distant kings. The surviving rebels would scatter afterward among hidden villages and woodland refugees near Ithilien, where Sauron's reach remained weaker for now. Eredwen approached Baradan beside the ruined watchpost as the others gathered supplies. "You could come with us," she said quietly. "There are free settlements farther south, where Mordor's hand does not yet rule." Baradan looked eastward through the trees. Though miles away now, he could still imagine the black gate rising stone by stone beneath smoke-dark skies. "No," he answered after a long silence. "My road leads elsewhere." Eredwen studied him carefully. Home? Baradan thought of the sea of rune and white harbour walls shining beneath the sun. Then he remembered slave chains crossing the eastern deserts toward Mordor. Perhaps, he said softly, or perhaps toward warning those who still believe distance will protect them. Eredwen nodded once, then lived long enough to speak that warning. When the sun finally rose above the eastern mountains, its light touched the distant towers of the Morannon far beyond the Eiffel Dueth. Even from leagues away, the gate seemed immense against the barren land surrounding it. Smoke curled upward around the unfinished battlements, while tiny figures moved constantly along the walls like ants swarming across a carcass. Sauron's fortress had survived sabotage, rebellion, monsters beneath the earth, and the deaths of countless laborers. The Black Gate would stand for ages to come. Yet deep beneath the western tower, hidden within the volcanic bedrock where no overseer had ever looked, narrow fractures waited silently inside the stone. Small flaws only, almost nothing. But stone remembered. And one day, long after Baradan and all who escaped Mordor had turned to dust beneath forgotten graves, the Black Gate of Mordor would tremble beneath war exactly as he intended.
Знаєте, друзі, моє відео мало, як сказати, донести до вас одну дивну річ, що великі темні часи майже ніколи не починаються з великих рішень. Вони починаються з маленьких поступок. Один чоловік мовчить, бо боїться. Інший каже собі, що просто виконує роботу. Хтось ще відкладає правду на завтра, бо сьогодні надто важко сперечатися з силою. І поступово з цих дрібних виборів виростають брами, великі брами, які потім уже ніхто не може зрушити. Мені здається, що саме тому історії Толкіна так довго живуть. Толкін – це просто геній. Вони не лишили, тобто вони не лише про якихось там героїв чи битви, вони про те, як одна людина, така маленька, непомітна, може залишити у світі або тріщину для темряви, або тріщину в самій темряві. І найстрашніше тут те, що часто ніхто навіть ніколи не бачить моменту, коли це стається. Мабуть, наше життя теж складається не з великих подвигів, а з тих рішень, які ми приймаємо тоді, коли ніхто не дивиться. Тому я думаю, що в будь-яких випадках нам треба залишатись людьми, як се каже, бути вірними самі собі, бути вірними правді і просто бути хоч трошечки схожими на тих героїв, про яких ми читаємо, слухаємо ці історії. Всім до побачення, з вами був Чон.